Good morning and welcome to Asia Gaming Brief's latest webinar. We're here today to talk about whether or not it's the end of the road for Macau's junket industry, and if so, what are the implications for the broader market, for the VIPs and the Asian gaming industry in general. Our webinar today has got a slightly different format than normal in that we have three core panelists, and we will also be inviting in three other speakers who are experts in their field and will be talking about connected issues. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my panelists. Joining me, I have Alidad Tash, who is the Managing Director of 2N28. It's a company specializing in all things integrated resorts. Alidad is a long-time gaming industry and Macau veteran. I also have with me today Martin Pubrick, who is a founder and director of Pubrick and Associates. He is also the chairman of the Anti-Illegal Gambling and Related Financial Crimes Committee at the Asia Racing Federation and former director of security at the Hong Kong Jockey Club. And lastly but not least, I have Carlos Simões, who is a founding partner with the law firm DSL. He is responsible for advising corporates and international funds on their projects in Macau, and has also been responsible for bringing foreign investment into the city. So without further ado, let's go to Alidad to start and ask the question, is the junket model dead, Alidad?
It appears so. Much to everyone's surprise, we all knew that junkets were going to go down, and this has been going on since 2013, but the last 12, 13 days is just the speed by which they're just on the way down and almost going to be diminished is mind-boggling.
Martin, what do you think?
Yeah, Sharon. It clearly is the end of the junket model. I'd also say that it's not the case that junkets are suddenly illegal in the People's Republic of China. That junket model has always been illegal in the People's Republic of China. And I think there's an interesting comment in Caixin, the Chinese magazine and newspaper today, which quotes a report from China International Capital Corp Limited, which is a state-owned enterprise, which said that although other junket operators haven't yet been affected, this incident does signal that, and I quote, their current business model may actually be illegal. And I think the point is it's always been illegal. But in other business sectors, you'll see that the law is enforced arbitrarily in China. And that's the point for gambling as well. When the authorities want to enforce the law, they'll enforce it. I think Steve Vickers is probably going to talk about the wider considerations and issues and other industries a bit later and why this is happening now.
Thank you. Carlos, I'd like to come to you on that as well, because it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because in Macau, the model isn't illegal. It is an operating model. Can you comment a little bit on that? And also, I'd like to come to you on the ruling by the regulator, the DICJ, that said you can't actually extend credit anymore. I mean, what does that mean in terms of Macau?
Sure. What I would say is that if we're going to go through the end of junkets, that's going to happen without minimum legal changes. Junkets have been a licensed activity in Macau since 2004. They are subject to supervision, and although we went through this storm since the arrest of Alvin Chau, the reality is there have been no legal changes to the existing regime. So if that's going to happen, that will be the case without any kind of legal action, without new legislation being enacted. That will be even the case in relation to what you just mentioned on the ICJ instruction requesting junkets to stop granting credit. Again, I would understand this measure as part of an overall review to understand how credit is being granted and whether it's being done legally. But in the way that this measure was taken, it is akin to revoking the existing law on granting of credit without going through any legislation change. So I would say from a legal point of view that everything is the same, but at the same time, everything has changed.
I think we'll come back to that later in the, because I think that's a very important issue, especially for foreign investors, this idea that the law can be changed quite so arbitrarily that Martin also just touched on. But for the time being, let's have a look at the VIP market in Macau. If we have lost the junkets, how are we? Do we have a future for VIP? Alidad, what would you like to bring on your slides and tell us a few things about what your forecasts are?
Yes, you asked me to prepare something for you, and I basically prepared one complicated slide. Let me go ahead and share screen slides if you don't mind. Okay, so I'm going to be basically looking at the gross gaming revenue and EBITDA in billions of US dollars under a few scenarios. My assumptions are going to be 50% of the junket play disappears, and the other 50% will be moving to premium mass and premium direct. First of all, let me define quickly what VIP gaming is and what is the non-VIP or mass gaming. VIP gaming is defined as premium direct and junkets. Premium direct is one-on-one. A player comes and makes a deal with the casino. The junket is one person coming in there on behalf of a whole bunch of gamblers and makes a deal with the casino. Junkets, the red ones, is the one that is going to be going away according to my definition. Non-VIP is divided into base mass, grind mass, different kinds of calling in mass, and then there's a premium mass, something that may not be familiar outside Macau. That is basically very, very high limits. It's a group of people who perhaps on a daily basis, their gaming exceeds the total amount that they're allowed to even bring out from China. These are major players that could be worth tens of thousands of dollars, US dollars, in expected gaming loss on a daily basis. I'm going to basically tell you what the 2019, the most recent pre-pandemic actual that we had of these groups. We had $15 billion in base mass, $6.6 billion in premium mass, $3 billion in premium direct, and $11 billion in junkets. And what I'm going to be doing through this simple slide is to explain to you what would potentially happen to these 11 billion. And oh, by the way, the gross gaming revenue is 36 billion. But if you convert it based on the EBITDA, the net profit that the casinos pocket, we're talking about $10 billion that the 6 gaming companies collect. As mentioned before, I'll be talking about the scenarios. What are the scenarios? Well, the scenarios will talk about the fact that the 50% is gone, 25% go to premium direct, 25% go to premium direct, premium mass. There is a best case, a base case, and a worst case. In the base case, I'm assuming that the same capital outflows are going to be happening as now. That means a person in China in the future will just be as likely to be able to take money out today as they were, in the future as they are today. And we all know that that is very optimistic. China is cracking down significantly on junkets, and part of it was because of the fact that they're so easy to go and take money illegally, exceeding the $50,000 US limits that they're allowed to do that. And I genuinely think, even though there's been a lot of analysts talking about it, I think that is not a realistic scenario. The other case is the base case, where I'm assuming that 25%, there will be some China pressure, some China crackdown on a capital outflow. And as a result, the premium mass and the premium direct, the 2 surviving segments, besides junkets that take into certain amount, large amounts of money, 25% of it will be affected. They're going to have a harder time bringing their money over, whether it's through UnionPay, jewelry shop, or again, they can't go through junkets anymore. So it's going to be a challenge. And the worst case will assume that 50%, there will be a case of 50% of a capital outflow. And that is a serious crackdown. I don't foresee anything further.
We seem to have lost your sound, Alidad.
Yeah. So in this example, the 50% disappears. The 25% go to the base case. And the base mass remains the same. The premium mass is going to have a little bit more, and the premium direct is going to have a little bit more. What that does is effectively loses $5.5 billion in total GGR, a decline of 15%. But curiously, the EBITDA goes up, the net profit goes up. Why is that? Because premium mass and premium direct have much healthier margin. Again, that is what a lot of people tell you, to buy stocks. This is a great thing. Life is wonderful. Buy, which I do not buy whatsoever. The base case is one where you have the same number of the same initial starting point of 9.4 and 5.7 billion, having additional numbers, but it shrinks because China is going to be exerting more pressure on bringing money over. These guys want to gamble, they just don't know how to bring their money over, and they used to use junkets to bring them over. And as a result, the GGR, gross gaming revenue, is going to be affected by 26%, but the EBITDA is going to go down only by 9.4%, to 9.4 billion, which is 6%. And in the worst case, again, the base mass remains as is, and we're going to have, I'm going to move this thing, we're going to have 36% decline. This really seriously affects the government because the government of Macau taxes based on the white, which is the gross gaming revenue. So they'll lose 36% of their revenue, which was the 39% game taxes. But the companies will only suffer 17%. So to recap, I believe that the reality is most likely to be in between the base case and the worst case. I'm leaning towards somewhere in the middle. So we're talking the operators are looking to lose somewhere around 10 to 15% of their EBITDA, and the government of Macau is going to lose somewhere between 26 and 36, give it 30% of their EBITDA, not of this year and the year before, but actually of the year 2019.
Given that, we've had a couple of horrible COVID years as it is, it's still a big chunk for the operators. I wonder whether we could get the other panelists back up and to discuss some of those, because I'd like to hear a bit. You mentioned China Union Pay, you mentioned the pawn shops. Surely the government is not going to allow people to circumvent the capital rules by using those things anymore. And the premium direct players, as you mentioned, spend a lot more than they're actually allowed to bring into Macau. So I'd like to ask you to comment on that, first of all, Alidad, but I'd like to ask the others what they think too. How are they going to bring the money in for the premium mass players?
That's exactly the question. I think there's going to be a harder time. I just simply do not believe, much like a lot of the conversation that happened the day before Alvin Chau, I published I was in a news feature saying that it's going to keep this disease is going to spread everywhere else. And they said, no, it's going to be Suncity. And then everybody was on board and said, no, it's okay, it's the Junket. I genuinely believe that China is flexing its muscle. It hasn't put the axe down. There's going to be more blood, and it will definitely be affecting the Union Pay. It will definitely be affecting the jewelry shop, and the digital currency, the digital renminbi is going to come a lot faster. It's definitely been put on the front burner. And as a result, Chinese patrons who have always been illegally taking money over $50,000 US, they're going to have a hard time. Just to remind everybody, $50,000 US is the total amount of money that a single Chinese person is allowed to take out the entire year, including tuition, including gaming, including everything else. And how do you
remind us a little bit just how much a premium player would normally gamble on a trip to Macau?
Exactly. There have been instances where you can have a premium player make $200,000 or $250,000 US a single bet. A typical gambler, a small premium mass player, which would be an upper high limit, but lower premium mass. It's not even the best of the best. We're talking $50,000 to $100,000 US per trip. And these guys make anywhere between 10 to 25 trips a year. So there is no way that this is going to be sustained. However, again, there are ways you can go old school and wear an expensive watch, pay for it in Shanghai, get across the border and pay it back to a jewelry store and get a refund, or maybe get 97% of your money back. That is an old school way of doing it. Perhaps we're going to go that way until the government of China will force the casinos to go use the digital renminbi, in which case, God help the casinos. They're going to have a hard time.
We'll come back to that because that's another big issue. Carlos, what's your view? Where do you stand on Alidad's predictions? Are you a base case, best case? And how do you see money coming into Macau with these premium mass gamblers who are such an important component of the casino industry now?
Well, I stand somewhere between the best case and the worst case scenario, as Alidad mentioned. But as Alidad also has reflected, this is going to be a very tough call for the Macau economy in the whole, because it's not only the junkets, there's a lot of activities that serve these players, these VIP players, that have been erected to serve them, to bring the best services, and there is a lot of spending in Macau that is related to them. So certainly there'll be a major impact, and how this system, without the junkets, it's going to able to bring players to Macau to keep spending money. That's a question that at the moment no one can answer, but it will be a problematic one for sure.
Martin, have you got a view on this?
Sure, yes. I think it's very interesting from Alidad to hear the breakdown of the segments, and but I'd also comment on how that money moves out of the mainland. Through pawn shops, through someone buying a Rolex. The technical term for that is money laundering. And that's the problem in Macau. So the primary concessions, the license holders, I think have to think very differently about their model in the future. The term integrated resorts really means that. I think for the past decade, the primary operators have managed with this junket model and become cash rich, and junkets have become cash rich as well. And as we sort of got onto a little bit, junkets have become regional entities in some ways. Suncity, of course, with resorts in other countries. So there's a lot of shakeout from this that I think, unfortunately, I don't think will benefit Macau. That money that Alidad mentioned, that demand for gaming from mainland China is definitely still there. It needs to exit the mainland, but where does it go? I sense it will be difficult to go to Macau because obviously it's within the PRC borders and the authorities have greater controls and greater scrutiny on everything. And hence I sense that there's more of that demand likely to go across the region, maybe even back to Vegas, if those players can get their money out of the mainland. But I think the junkets will be gone from Macau, and the junkets that have diversified into regional entities, including Suncity, which obviously had business in Australia, which is probably died, which we'll hear a bit about later on, but have casinos in or VIP rooms in Vietnam, Philippines, Vladivostok. These places are going to see some of that demand that was going to Macau going elsewhere in the future, I think.
Well, that actually sounds like a very good time to bring in our next speaker, who is Ben Lee. He's the managing partner of iGamix International Management and Consulting. He's a very well-known figure in Asia's gaming industries and has worked extensively across Southeast Asia. Ben, are these other jurisdictions that Martin talked about going to be, well, welcome, first of all, are they going to be benefiting from this, or are they going to be suffering too because of the China clampdowns?
Well, that's a very good question, because I think we have seen some constraints already imposed by China on some of these other jurisdictions. So, for instance, I think it was last week that there was a news report about China stopping half the passengers on the flight to Cambodia from boarding the flight. So, they're not going to just limit their crackdown on gambling just to Macau. Obviously, they are aware that, if you squeeze Macau, it's going to go somewhere else, and they're going to follow those people into the other jurisdictions. Now, this whole thing about the blacklist that China has announced, not once, not twice, but 3 times, to me, it's not just a case of different countries or jurisdictions being blacklisted, but I think it's also probably a list of different tiers of treatment. So Macau is probably on the lowest tier in that, they will allow people to come into Macau, provided they are individually vetted, every single one of them. Same thing probably, but probably tighter if they were to go to Cambodia. Cambodia is a friendly country to China, and therefore, they want to basically look after Cambodia. So, they will allow some traffic into Cambodia, which they have been, but again, they will exercise when they need. They will exercise restraint and constraints when they need to. And then you've got the others like Philippines, where it's gone from one end of the spectrum to the other, where the anti-gambling has now become full-on gambling. You've got online gambling, Pogo, Pigo, and so I haven't heard of any Chinese tourists being allowed into the Philippines as yet. So you do have different tiers, and we think that's what's happening.
Okay. What about Vietnam? You didn't mention Vietnam.
Vietnam is one of those, at the moment, Vietnam hasn't opened its border. So it's very hard for us to say how China would treat Vietnam, except that, again, you've got this balance in terms of their regional diplomacy vis-a-vis the United States. So, you have both superpowers trying to get Vietnam into their sphere. So, there's a possibility that they could be very soft towards gambling in Vietnam initially until they've built sufficient soft power, at which time then they could probably exercise some leverage over Vietnam.
Okay, so obviously we talked a minute ago about how important the VIP and the premium mass sectors were to Macau. What about to these other jurisdictions around Asia, some of these big resorts that have been built with the Chinese, pretty much the Chinese VIP in mind? How are they going to fill those? Well, what are they going to do?
Well, you must know then that we did a lot of the feasibility studies for some of the big projects around the region. And Hoi An is one of them. It was a VIP-centric model that we constructed, not only for Hoi An, but a few of the other projects that are currently in the pipeline. What's going to happen? And we have already started advising our clients that you have to revisit the business model that was originally constructed, because what was then applicable 2 years, 3 years ago when we did the original study is no longer applicable. You can no longer rely on the VIP market for, at that time, we were projecting 70 to 80% of your bottom line. So it's going to be harder for those projects, because now we're going to have to excuse me, revert to the traditional model, which is mass-centric. You cover your overheads, you cover all your base costs with mass, and then the VIP gives you the cream. The problem is that in almost every jurisdiction in Asia, local gaming is not allowed or not encouraged. So you don't really have that mass to be able to bulk up your bottom line. So that leaves some of these resorts in a quandary. Where are they going to source the revenue? And it's certainly not going to be mass, because some of them don't even have the ability to target a local mass. And in terms of targeting foreign mass, it's quite difficult as well. There's no VIPs. I dare say that they would have to undergo severe cost restructuring to bring down their massive cost overheads in line with a new projected reality.
Interesting times for sure. I'd like to sort of change track just a little bit, as one of the things that was touched upon, and I think Martin referred to it too, the government, they spoke about proxy betting and online betting. Where is that coming from, and how prevalent is it? Well,
approximately, if you were to look at the Philippines, there was one particular operator who let slip that the industry there was worth something in the vicinity of 135 billion US dollars. Our own research suggests it was a little below that, just a bit about 90 to 100 billion, but certainly it's not too far. Now, 90 to 95% of that was coming from China. And in fact, the Chinese press say that they put a figure of 1 trillion renminbi themselves out there in the public space. So it was a huge drain on China's economy, but more importantly, if we look at the online, not proxy, they targeted the mass, not the VIPs. So you are talking about millions and millions of low-end customers, all on Weibo and Weixin, or social chat forum, being lured into this big nest that is online gambling. What you talk about proxy, that's a very different kettle of fish that is aimed at the upper tier, because obviously you got to have enough bankroll to warrant the junket operators keeping, a team of proxy to sit there waiting for you to call in.
And so that, your buy-in is going to be large enough to warrant that. So they're very, very different. They aim at very different segments of the market. The proxy is slowly dying because of China's crackdown. And one of the key to the proxy market is that a lot of the settlement, the transactions were actually settled in Macau. I know of CFOs flying into Macau to collect cash in Macau. The online, they do it a different way. They do it through the myriads of Alipay merchants and WeChat merchants. They have very different channels. So the proxy is already dying, and now the POGO operators are pivoting towards the domestic market in Pigo. So, there are two very different segments, but the online, what's going to happen is when China cracks down on them, they pivot to other markets. For a while, they went back to Cambodia. Now China's after them in Cambodia again. Some of them are even looking as far as the country of Georgia in Eastern Europe to try and set up online gaming over there.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Ben. I'm going to stop you there and invite you back at the end to answer any questions and go back to our panel, because I'd like to get Martin to talk a little bit about the online side of things, because I know he's been looking into this. Martin, back to you. Those are pretty big numbers being floated by Ben there. Could understand why China does see this as a threat to its financial stability. I mean, it's quite clear, really. What would you say?
Sure. I think Ben touched on some really important points there that go on to why this is happening now. In particular, the scale of online gambling and online sports betting, and also Macau as a settlement center for some of that online activity. I think both of them are part of the cause of this enforcement action happening now. As I said earlier, I think the enforcement could have happened at any time, because within the boundaries of PRC law, much of this activity has been illegal anyway. It's just a question of when the authorities enforce it. So I think the scale of the activity, especially relating to the growth of online gambling, especially relating to the role of Macau as a settlement center with money flowing out. And when we talk about money flowing out, obviously capital outflow from the PRC has been a problem that the authorities have been concerned about for many years, and it waxes and wanes. But I've seen estimates that Macau has been possibly up to a fifth of the total as a conduit for capital outflow from China. So that's really where I think the authorities can finally see this problem. And typically with the central government, Central People's Government in China, they're slow to see certain problems and slow to understand certain problems. Partly because people at the periphery and in regions don't like to report things unless they really understand the extent of the problem. But once they understand it in Central People's Government, they do crack down significantly. And I think this issue of online betting, online gambling and online sports betting is part of the understanding that's grown. And we can see that from the crackdown, which started about 2018. Intensified in 2020 and continues now. And that's a crackdown on cross-border illegal betting and illegal gambling on websites hosted offshore, which includes Suncity. And obviously the Wenzhou Public Security Bureau warrant mentions the online gambling from Suncity, its operations in the Philippines, and its role as a settlement center in Macau. So I think you can see from these pieces of information in the language what causes the authorities concern. And you go back to Alidad's point about the segments, the demands there. Clearly that demand will continue, but it has to have a legal avenue in a method and a structure that the authorities will tolerate, and without contributing to that capital outflow, which I think Ben went on to, because as you said, a great deal of that targeting from these online gambling and online sports betting operators has been at mass market. And I think that's what starts to spook the authorities in the PRC.
It's we're starting to get a little bit into the whole one country, two systems sphere and two different legal systems here, which is something I wanted to leave towards the end. But would you like to comment on that from a legal perspective, Carlos?
Well, what I would like to say to take from what the previous speakers have said is firstly that something that is entirely new on this junket crisis was that Macau was finally targeted. It became an issue of concern for the mainland government, and the actions that were taken affect directly Macau and the way our economy is structured. At the beginning, there was an impression that only other jurisdictions would be affected by the clampdown on cross-border gambling, but now we realize that Macau is also affected. Macau is not going to be exempted, and Macau will have to restructure its economy and its gaming market to address that change. I would also say that we can see also that locally there was not really any kind of preparation to address these. There were not government policies that were enacted to prepare the market and to prepare the players and the operators to this change. Instead, if you open now the page of the ICJ, you can still see the list there, and there's even a performance pledge from the ICJ that they will give a license to a junket within a certain time limit. So we are dealing with activities that in a formal way, they are legal in Macau, although I can understand that's not the case in China. So I guess to take also on what Martin said, to have new avenues, new ways to bring money in to Macau to be gambled there. I guess we need a lot more coordination between the Macau government and the mainland China government, and we need probably some decisions, some quick decisions on what they want as the future for this sector, for the junket sector. Sorry.
Alidad, you've got your hand up.
Unlike, about a few hundred years ago, people used to think the Earth is the center of the universe, the sun goes around it. That is not the case. We tend to believe in Macau. Every single thing China does is targeting Macau. That is not the case. As Ben pointed out, the report came from Xinhua middle of 2019. It said 1 trillion renminbi, which is about 150 billion US, 4 or 5 times larger than Macau, is being spent on proxy betting. That is a national security threat to China, as they have admitted it. As a result, Suncity is not just guilty of the crime of operating a junket. It also, the biggest sin that it did is it facilitated the flow of money far beyond the 30 or 40% it controlled. Forget what it did in Macau in premium mass and premium direct and junkets. It facilitated lots and lots of billions of dollars of Chinese money leaving the country. So that is the center of the universe now. The sun is China, and we're just rotating around it. That's my first point. The second point is that somebody made a point, I think maybe it was one of the questions that was asked, are the junket operators going to pick up and go somewhere else? They can't, because the source of the money is Chinese players. China is not doing anything anti-Macau. It's doing something defending China. So they're going to have just as hard a time getting Chinese money and Chinese players to Vladivostok, to Manila, to Cebu, to Vietnam, to elsewhere. The problem is China is closed when it comes to any of those kinds of excessively large capital leaving the country.
I'm going to jump in with one question from the audience now, because I've seen a couple of people ask the same thing while we're on this particular subject. We've talked a lot about Suncity, but do you think the other junkets are going to be targeted in this as well? Because they've all been doing the same thing.
Yes, the king is whatever Suncity did. All the other junket operators said, "We'll do whatever Suncity did. We'll just do it more quiet. We won't be as ostentatious." But yes, this is obviously, as we've seen already the last couple of days, this has already spread to other junkets, and we all know the entire junket model is dead. That was the first question you posed to me. It wasn't whether Suncity is dead. So yes, the other ones try to do exactly what Suncity does. Some of them, none of them have been as successful as they have been. But yeah, this is definitely junket-like.
Okay, I'm going to come back and bring everybody back on a bit later on. But in the meantime, I'd like to go over to Kelly Amato. She is an analyst in Australia with Fitch Ratings, and she's going to have a chat with us about basically post-junket world, because the Australian operators have had to basically drop their junkets since the Crown scandal. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what the Macau system could have learned from Australia and what it should be learning now. So welcome, Kelly. Nice to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Firstly, should Crown have seen its troubles coming? And are there any parallels with what's happened to Suncity?
In some ways, yes. We had the Crown arrest in 2016, so obviously there was heightened scrutiny when it came to VIP betting in China with regards to Crown, and that could have alluded to some of the other operations that the regulators have really cracked down on them for over the past 2 years. But in some respects as well, yes, it was probably showing there was some smoke there, and then obviously in 2019 we had the in-depth media investigations around Crown engaging in money laundering, also the Chinese gaming laws, and just partnering with the junket operators to the fore, and that really got the regulators looking, and we've subsequently had those in-depth reviews where Crown was deemed unfit to hold their license, and they're currently going through that remediation process. And out of those reviews, there's also been a ban of junket operations in Australia now.
So what are the operators? I mean, obviously the VIP segment was never as important in Australia as it has been elsewhere in Asia, but how are they dealing now with those VIP customers? How are they getting credit to gamble? Is that even allowed? I don't know. What's the post-junket model there in Australia?
Yeah, well, the official banning is actually a relatively recent development, and we've had COVID and the closure of Australia's borders over the past 2 years, so it hasn't really been at the forefront of what's going on, just purely because the gamblers can't get here. But what we have seen with those border closures is we've been given an opportunity to see how the casinos will actually react to pretty much zero VIP revenue, and we think this is going to be a good indication of how the Australian gaming operators' business models may look going forward with the banning of the junkets. So overall, what we've actually seen over the past 2 years is we've seen a real demonstration of the importance and resilience of the domestic mass market in Australia, and it's probably a little bit different to what Ben alluded to before, where the Asian countries don't necessarily have access to that. In Australia, domestic mass is very strong, and the casinos are able to tap that, and they're helped by they basically have a monopoly in each of the cities, so they do have a really strong mass market. And over the 2 years, that's typically rebounded very quickly following the relaxation of any COVID restrictions. So for the gaming operators here, it isn't, as you say, there's been a reconfiguration of businesses, but it's also been a refocus on the business segments that historically has driven their gaming turnover and profits. And, just to give some context, as you alluded to before, VIP in Australia is pretty small. It's typically made up only 20 to 30% of pre-pandemic gaming revenues. And like has been alluded to before, that is actually at a lower margin as well. So the profitability contribution is even less than that. So with the ban on junkets, even if that resulted in 100% of VIP revenues disappearing, it would translate to a smaller loss of profits than what the headline revenue suggests. So on the whole, the Australian operators' business model effectively still remains intact, and that's reflected in Fitch maintaining its BBB rating on Crown, which still remains one of the highest gaming ratings globally. And we also, as Alidad alluded to before, we don't think that the loss of the junkets will see all the VIP revenues disappear in Australia. They'll transition to some sort of direct VIP or premium mass once the borders are fully reopened and players outside the junket programs can return.
Sorry, I just have one last question for you, really, because obviously over the years or in the past sort of decade or so, there has been a lot of investment in the Australian casinos into upgrading a lot of their facilities, when they had their eyes on that Asian VIP model, Crown in particular with the Barangaroo property in Sydney was supposed to be just a VIP property. What are they doing with those assets? What are they doing to reposition them now?
Yeah, that's probably the one property in Australia, Crown Sydney, that is going to have to reconfigure with the ban on junkets. As we all know, that license allows for premium players only, and that was always going to be generated. Some of that was always going to be generated by junkets. So now what they're going to have to do is go to rely on that direct VIP premium mass to generate the gaming revenue. And that's expected to dampen the returns on the property. And it will do, even though VIP isn't a major sector for the Australian gaming operators, it will have a similar impact across the board. But what Crown needs to do is now attract individuals to their property, and we think that that's going to heighten the importance of the non-gaming offering just to entice people to the property in the first place. So you'll see things like theatre shows, like I think the Star in Sydney has recently hosted Hamilton, which has brought a lot of people in, and we think that Crown is going to use the restaurants and all the other facilities as hotel at the property to entice people in there, as opposed to them going across the harbour to Star for a night out or just going somewhere else in the city. So this is another refocus that we think that the gaming operators are going to have to embark on just to meet this changing dynamic in the sector.
I think that might be music to the Macau government's ears, actually. That seems to be what they're like. Would you stay with us and come back at the end for anybody's questions? I'm going to move on now without going back to the panel, because I'd like to get to our next guest and leave plenty of time for discussion after the following one at the end. This next speaker is Mr. Steve Vickers. He is the founder of Vicker and Associates, and he is a long-term expert and veteran in Asia in the matters of political and risk security. So there you are, Steve. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm coming to you now to get to the bigger picture, because I know you've got some very strong views on this. Firstly, why now? And then secondly, directly on from that, do you think that this is just targeting the junkets, or is this more of China targeting Macau's gambling industry?
Okay. Thank you for the kind introduction. That just means I'm old. Okay. But moving on from that. Look, what's going on in Macau? I don't think China is targeting Macau. I think there are some very significant political changes underway in the mainland. Macau, whether the people like it or not, is part of China. And so let's look at what's gone on very recently. There's been massive impact on the technology industry, significant. There's been a huge impact on property, Evergrande and many other downstream properties, and huge problems. There's been a crackdown in the education sector, and now we have what is the beginning of a major crackdown on gaming. Gaming not being a healthy development in the parlance that's currently being used politically. Suncity, I think, probably flagrantly, or is alleged to have flagrantly breached capital control regulations beyond that which had been tolerated for many years. And I think Macau is perceived at the central level as not having made significant or sufficient progress on diversification. So if 80+ % of your revenues come from gaming, that is not, that's not progress. So for all of those reasons, and in particular the capital outflows issues associated with what's gone on, Macau have been sucked into this vortex. This is a significant change. It's not just about junkets and whether we describe them as premium mass or junket. It's gone beyond that. This is a significant, I think, very significant difference. And I think the government will push very hard to try and turn Macau into something different than it is at the moment. But as I say, that will be a very painful exercise. And it also brings up pretty scary issues for the current concessionaires pension funds and others that have invested in those and the general shareholders themselves. So I think they're the big picture reasons why something has happened. On top of that, obviously, when people misbehave on a large scale, then they've kind of invited perhaps the action a little earlier than was always intended.
So you mentioned the concessionaires. We did a survey a little while ago where this was prior to the latest developments in the rest of Suncity, where we asked people what they thought the most likely scenario would be when the concessions come up. Would it be all 6 getting the same licenses, the same 6 with the same licenses? And the consensus view was that. Where do you stand on that? And do you think that people may be a bit more doubtful now?
I think all bets are off. Pardon the pun. I think it is an issue of both business risk, political risk, their perception with the central government as to whether or not they just built a roaring casino and nothing to go with that. Each major concessionaire has a slightly different profile. Some of them built a lot, both entertainments, apart from the casinos and the hotels and the MICE and the rest. They will probably have one risk perspective. There'll be a big difference between local and American and foreign ones, given the current rate of the parlor state of relations between the US and China. And then I think within that, there will be subdivisions as to whether or not there will be new laws. Given everything is in the hands of the government now, we've got just 6 months to go before the concessions are up. Of course, they could be extended. It gives the government a very strong hand to do what they want. So, for example, are we going to say foreign participation percentage-wise will be reduced? Are we going to say that repatriating profits, for example, at the moment, the bigger American casinos have been very successful in repatriating profits, which is probably pretty unpopular at central government level. So will that directly change? And then maybe fundamentally, the use of the Hong Kong dollar in Macau, as opposed to MOPS, and whether there will be a goal. I don't know whether they could do it overnight, but whether there might be a goal to move with digital renminbi and to have gaming for Chinese people in China in digital renminbi. Again, that might be difficult for some of the foreign casinos or concessionaires to calibrate in relation to the scale of their business, their debt obligations, and the rest. So we're living in a very interesting time.
So given that you're an American operator in Macau, you've been used to a certain level of return from your gaming activities. Now it looks like there's going to be very strict limits on what the return might be going forward due to the changes that are being forced in the market, not by natural economic measures, but by the government's actions. You also might be asked to invest in non-gaming activities on the mainland that perhaps wouldn't have the return that you might be looking for. Is it really worth bidding for the license again? Is there a certain point where you might have to say the risk isn't worth it? I mean,
well, that's why everybody needs to very dispassionately analyze what the impact is to their business, the scale of their business, what they've done to date. As I say, the debt obligations. Political risk is absolutely paramount right now. It's a really important issue. And then everybody just needs to study it very, very carefully. To date, people have kind of buried their heads in the sand. I mean, I'm not being rude about it, and I understand why people are employed and jobs, they want to stay there. But I think there's been no realism. So I think the next step is a realistic appraisal, discussions with the right people. Some organizations, racing organizations and others, have built things in strange places on the mainland. Others have invested in all sorts of things. So I think it's a time now to work out how are we perceived, what are the options, what's the likelihood as we move forward. If US-China relations degenerate further, how might that impact where we are? And I think the junket model, I mean, everybody's been very accurate. I mean, I've always hated the junket model, but I'm surprised it's lasted as long as it has. But I think we can pretty well say the junket model, as we understand it, is gone.
Thanks, Steve. I'd like you to stay with us if you can, because I want to bring in all of our other panelists right now and to discuss some of those things, because I think it really gets to the crux of the matter. In particular, Carlos, question for you. Obviously, you speak to foreign investors a lot. At which point for you is it no longer worth having a casino license in Macau if you're a foreign investor?
Well, I believe no one is in a position now to reply to that question. As mentioned earlier, all these political risks and the changing environment make it very difficult for that decision to be made and for a proper answer to be considered. At this moment, I believe we're still far from concluding that it's not worth it, the investment, the keeping the license. But I guess as this develops and as we see the impact of the current changes in the market, we might have different reactions to this question, and it will be considered more seriously. But I guess it's too early to say no.
Yeah, appreciate that. It has been such an amazing investment for so long. We've touched on the subject of digital renminbi a few times, and we've glossed over and moved swiftly on. I'd quite like to come back to it now, because Alidad, you said basically heaven help the operators were that to be the case. Would you like to elaborate on why you think that's heaven help them?
First of all, let me very politely disagree with the last two speakers when it comes to the licenses. Yes, they are both correct that if a brand new US operator or outside operator were to come to Macau, this may not look like a very good decision to whether or not to proceed. It's actually questionable. However, we're talking about Wynn, MGM, and Sands, which have together put down 7, 9, and anywhere like 15 to 16 billion dollars in just infrastructure. Why in the world would they want to go and say, thanks, we don't want to play this game anymore? All they need to do is sit back and collect a lot less money than before, but it's still positive money. I mean, Sands alone can sit there and collect tons of money with his 12 to 13,000 hotel rooms. That's pure non-gaming, and tons of mass. MGM and Wynn, an unintended consequence of this entire junket demise has been that Wynn and MGM, which used to legitimately complain about not having enough gaming tables, suddenly have all these gaming tables on the mass. So that definitely is a possibility for them to be able to, should they improve their strategies, to proceed. So for the three existing American or foreign operators today, of course, don't spend too much, do a little bit on refurbishment and enjoy the next 10 years of gaming license until the next one comes along. And even if it means higher taxes, which I still believe that there's going to be more higher gaming taxes because Macau's got a 30% shortfall coming up, I think it's still worth it. You guys know. Regarding the digital renminbi, if the government forces everyone to use digital renminbi, it makes it so much more transparent. And that's what the junket model was against. It was supposed to be opaque deliberately, so nobody knew what was happening. China needs to say, excuse me, where did this money come from? And, you know, we've all seen, some of us who lived in Macau, we've all seen the cases of people with literally 150 Union Pay card, where a guy goes in there to the ATM with a big bouncer guy next to him, and he puts in one card, gets the maximum, puts in another card, gets the maximum, and the guy basically carries a money bag, a huge sack of money when it goes out. That has got to stop, and China needs to stop it, and the easiest way is the digital currency. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'm sure there's other people who want to.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Ben on that one, if I can, on the digital currency. I mean, surely in some ways, does that solve the cross-border outflow problem and access to capital for gamers or not?
Well, we've actually had a whole webinar on this. And as you know, I was the first one to raise the issue way back in August last year. You know, the potential replacement of the Hong Kong dollar, which was a conduit essentially a conduit for the mainlanders to get their money out of Macau, and from Macau out to the rest of the world, whether it be Canada, Australia, whatever custody, Hong Kong dollar is easily convertible. Now, and then to come back to the point that I think Carlos brought up, not Carlos, Martin brought up earlier, where he said he saw a figure of 5 times whatever the GGR was. Again, it was me bringing that up, in that when we talk about $45 billion worth of gaming revenue in 2013, the amount of cash that came into the casino in order for the casino to hold $45 billion was roughly $225 billion, or 5 times, assuming a hold rate of 20%. And then if you add site betting and everything into it, we estimated the amount of cash that flowed in Macau in 2013 was over $600 billion. That was all opaque. That was all through the underground channels. So, the whole thing with the digital renminbi was that, the Hong Kong dollar is an anachronism in Macau. It was introduced to make it easy for the Hong Kongers to come and play Macau. Saves them having to come in, convert to takas, and then go back. And at the same time, we in Macau enjoyed a 3% premium on the exchange. So it was make it easy for them. But Hong Kong hasn't been a market for us for the last 10, 15 years. So the mainland Chinese, they come to play, they get their money out, renminbi, they convert to Hong Kong dollar, they play. And guess what? Win or lose, the remaining 80% of the cash that comes in does not go back to China. It remains in Hong Kong dollar, or it gets converted to other currencies and spirited out of the region. So the digital renminbi will allow China to basically track the movement of funds from China and Macau. It will allow them to actually allow or disallow certain functions. So if they said, I don't want this particular person to be able to utilize it, bang. Or I don't want this industry to utilize it, done. It gives them a level of control that is unprecedented. But that's on the negative side. It will stop the VIP, it will stop the premium mass, but what it does do, and this is the upside for Macau, is that it brings us into a single currency jurisdiction with China. We will now really be able to consider China as our mass market. Right now, the visitors are subject to constraints on the amount of money they bring out and how they bring it out. So this will open up China's 1.5 billion finally to Macau. We will have the mass market. If we do things right in terms of investment in Hengqin Island and all that, we may really finally be able to position ourselves as the destination for international destination for tourism and leisure, which we were supposed to 15 years ago, 20 years ago, but we haven't really got there.
I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on that, because I'm aware that we've been going for an hour now, so I'd quite like to get to some questions, but does anybody want to follow up on what Ben said on the digital renminbi?
Well, I have to agree that the digital yuan could be a solution to many of these problems, but the process hasn't started, and there's still a lot of work to be done. We have to agree on that. It's an ideal solution, but it's not yet there. And once again, if it's going to work, we need clear directives, we need clear policies, and we need the local government to come up and say, that's what we want to do, we support this, and we want to move away from the use of the Hong Kong dollar and into this new currency. And that has not been seen. Thank you.
So basically, we need more clarity then from the government in Macau at this particular point in time. Exactly. Is the key thing, is clarity. So Martin, would you like to comment on something there?
Sure. I think it's fascinating to hear Alidad and Ben talk about what comes next, because as Alidad says, the primary concession holders, license holders, can sit back. And as Ben pointed out, this huge growth in mass market explains why they can sit back and still make a great deal of money. And obviously, if the digital renminbi happens and that incorporates Macau, it's a political game changer as well as an economic game changer. But perhaps we can step back from that and also consider what happens in the rest of the region, because junkets are still here. What we're talking about is the end of the junket model in Macau, but junkets still exist and they're not going to go away. All of these people who've made a huge amount of money, not just in the past 15 years since the licensing system was liberalized, but in the many years before that as well, have all the smart ones have already started looking at other markets, including Suncity. So I think we have this junket model that doesn't disappear, it changes. And junkets will still exist in the region. And I think how they diversify will be interesting, looking at other jurisdictions that are not as well regulated as Macau. Macau is clearly more tightly regulated now, with the PRC exercising more controls. But there are plenty of jurisdictions in the region that have little or no regulation. There are plenty, as Ben pointed out, that have little or no legal gambling or betting products. Look at Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, etc. They have large, increasingly wealthy middle classes that have entertainment dollars to spend. So there's a lot of junket opportunities in the region as for the smart ones that diversify. I think this is the interesting point on a regional basis of what comes next.
Can I jump in there on Martin's point, please?
Yes, I will going to ask you the question though, because we do have a question that's come up here saying that will other countries follow China's example in cracking down on junkets? So maybe you could follow up on that.
So the Macau junket model is unique in that they operate on a fixed room basis. You know, what the casinos provide the dealing staff, the junkets provide the hosts, the waiters, waitresses, the VIP services in terms of drivers, and so forth and so forth. That was only feasible in Macau because of the large volumes that the players from China generate, and that allows the junket operators to cover their costs, and they had tremendous fixed costs. Now, the other model that Martin could be alluding to is what we call the Southeast Asian model, or in other words, casual junkets. These are junkets who basically lead groups of players to Australia, to Philippines, to Vietnam, to Cambodia. They don't have a fixed room. So they have a junket rep that will lead a group of players, be it 5 or 10 or 20, essentially like a tour group, with a junket rep acting as the group leader or group guide. And the junket rep is there to an extent. The junket rep will look after the exchange, the transaction, the rolling, but they rely on the casinos, VIP staff for a lot of the basic services that in Macau are covered by the junket. Now, what this model is good for is that it is extremely flexible. It's very nimble. You don't have, as I said before, your fixed overheads, but you have the appearance of essentially a tour group where the junket rep may actually be the junket boss, and he may be a player himself. So he conducts the transactions with the casino, and as far as the casino is concerned, the junket boss or junket rep is the player that they're dealing with, and he has friends that he's passing chips to. Now, this happened in Singapore when the two IRs there started. All right, and and what happened was the CRA got wind of it, they cracked down on it. But since then, what they've been doing is the junkets will hand off their guests to the casinos, and then the casinos say, "Don't you come? I'll look after your players, and I'll treat them as my direct players, but we'll settle with you in Macau or wherever." So there is that possibility. So the Southeast Asian model will definitely re-emerge. It's still surviving in various parts of Indonesia, but we may have this subterfuge junket group or arrangements emerging.
That doesn't sound like a particularly positive thing to me. I don't know whether somebody else Perhaps our legal folks want to weigh in on that. Does anybody else want to follow up on that?
I just want to point out that the percentage of junket players from China going away is significant. Yes, there have been junkets way before Macau. There have been junkets operating out of Korea, out of Philippines, many years ago. But we're talking about 85–90% of that business is gone. And yeah, these little guys will survive. Whether or not Macau operators will be crazy enough to want to go and engage them, that's something else, especially how China is not looking at them, looking at it very favorably. This also applies to the question you said about the other countries. They asked what happens to the other countries. Yes, another country like Vietnam, another country like Philippines can go and say, yeah, we accept all junkets. But then if China says, guess what? Half or more than half of the people who are gambling on their junkets in your country is from mainland China, guess what? We're going to stop the flow of tourists into Manila, not just gaming tourists. And that is, they're going to be able to control the flow of the flights into the Manila, into various jurisdictions. So they better watch out. That's how China is able to go ahead and flex this muscle to make sure that just do whatever you want, just don't take our money and our players. We've had enough. They'd rather have it go through Macau because at least they can tax 39% of it comes back as opposed to having it disappear elsewhere and you don't know how to track it and you don't know where the money's gone.
Martin, would you like to follow up on that? And also, I'm going to throw in a question as well, because I think it touches on this, where's the money going? If it's not in Macau, where is it going? I've got a few questions on that.
Sure. I actually completely agree with Ben and Alidad. There's very interesting points here about the difficulty of getting money out of China for gambling elsewhere, either in Macau or the rest of the region, and the differences in the junket model in the rest of the region. I think there are two aspects that will be interesting going forward as to what happens in the rest of the region. Firstly, I'm very skeptical that the controls by the Central People's Government will work. And that's because there's so much hot money been coming out of China for more than 2 decades. And it's really a whack-a-mole model. Although they'll be exercising greater regulatory control over Macau, that hot money is not going to suddenly be invested in legitimate activities. It has to find other outlets. Gambling still remains a useful outlet for that hot money. So I think the controls that the PRC introduces, I'm skeptical that they'll be successful. So that money will still come out somehow. And I think through the gambling.
Where will it go?
And
Where will it go?
Online is a big question. So we have a study from the Asian Racing Federation that we'll publish in Q1 of 22. And this will be a study of all online gambling, both legal and illegal. And one of the points that my colleagues in that highlight is that in 2021, traffic to all online gambling and websites has increased by 37%. Now, obviously, a huge amount of that is related to the pandemic. All these people who used to go to places to gamble or bet or whatever other entertainment they had on the side have to stay at home. So we all know that online gambling and online betting has increased significantly during the pandemic. That can still come out of China. I think junkets and related enterprises will find a way for it to exit the country. And online is probably the growth channel for that. Not just online sports betting, but online table gaming with proxy gambling involved. And that's the bigger concern in Australia. I've been dealing with the regulators there. The biggest question is not how do you stop the junkets entering, because they can do that. Bigger concern is how do you stop proxy gambling in the future in Australia and casinos. So I think online is a channel we're going to see growth in.
So I suppose I feel like I should come back to a quick one from me, but then we'll get back to some of the questions. Why doesn't China regulate? Isn't that the easiest answer? Anybody want to tackle that one?
Regulate what? Regulate what?
Yes.
Gambling. If it's got $150 billion a year leaving out of the country, messing with its financial system, could they not consider regulating gambling? Is that not the answer in the future?
I think that's a very Western way of looking at it. That you got to drive out this. The way to control the scene is by bringing it out into the open. But I think that everything we have seen and read and heard coming out from China is that it is totally against the core of the central party in China.
I mean, there is no way. I find it very difficult for China to go and tax it. They've managed to survive and been very patiently waiting for Macau to act and clean up gaming. They've given multiple warnings from 2013, 14, 15. And isn't it ironic? Isn't it bizarre and curious that the warrant of arrest goes on Friday morning, 24 hours later, Macau concludes its 14-year investigation the same day, and obviously they don't want this thing to get out of Macau. And basically China said, Macau, you never cleaned up what you wanted to do. We respect gaming and 150 plus years. Guess what? You're gonna have clean gaming. No more dirty business, no more this ostentatious, no more this bizarre spending and the crazy headlines and the guy having too many girlfriends and wives and kids and pregnancies. No, clean it up, have very few people come and gamble, that's it. And that makes the most sense, again, in my opinion.
I have a question, is an operational question. Anybody can answer it really. Perhaps Carlos is the best placed, but will the operators, can they extend direct credit to their customers?
Of course they can. They probably have not been very prone to do that. They have left that activity to be done by the junkets, but now they have to review it and they have to take the matter in their hands. I also wanted to agree with what Ben mentioned before. We started this discussion to say that it's the end of junkets, and now we are having a plan B, and probably junkets are going to be converted into tour guides or travel agencies, but the reality is that they're not going to go away. They're not going to, there's just too much money and just too much people involved on this, and they simply are not going to disappear. Probably they'll have to convert their model. They'll have to stop doing illegalities in China, but they're still licensed in Macau and they're still supervised by the government. So probably going to have a different junket model for the future. That's for sure.
Sorry, casinos can, Carlos is correct in that casinos can extend credit, but they would have to be foolish to do so because they cannot enforce any debts in mainland China. Why in the world would a casino pay 39%, far above Las Vegas' 7% in taxes, and also pay another 42% to junkets? They did it because junkets are the only ways who illegally went and collected this debt. So there's no way the casinos are crazy enough to actually go and extend credit to anybody in mainland China. To other countries, yes, they do it on a regular basis because there's a good credit system. But in mainland China, absolutely not.
To contradict you, Alidad, we have seen casinos in Macau do that. They do it under the facade that, well, you know, they have collectible assets in Hong Kong and so forth and so forth. But if you were to look at the financials of Sands in 2015, 2016, they had bad debts. And same with Melco in the last 2 years. So they do extend credit and they do turn in bad debt. But coming back to Carlos's point, the junkets were allowed to extend credit, but look at where it's got them. So obviously China has a different interpretation of what's legal and what's not. So what's legal in Macau is not legal in China. So the casinos may do that. And in fact, I say that the ones who are still continuing to extend credit to the so-called premium mass or VIP direct customers or whatever, they put themselves on the same slippery slope as the junkets did. And this is the next new gray area, not just the credit, but the fact that the casinos themselves, through their incentivization programs, their complementaries, their direct marketing hosts and marketing executives, they are promoting gambling into China. So, you know, I see that the premium mass, and coming back to one of Alidad's earlier points in the presentation, I believe that the VIP direct segment
is going to be similarly impacted by these measures, by this latest development. I talked to a couple of hosts just before I left Macau, and they were saying that at the moment, the number of premium mass customers, VIP direct, and the same hosts look after both segments, has dropped 80% compared to pre-COVID. The quality of the premium mass has dropped significantly because of very intensive competition between all the casino operators, to the point where some casino operators are now giving away 40% EBITDA margin just to grab the customers from their competitors. And a premium mass customer in 2014 who was somewhere between $25,000 to $250,000 Hong Kong ADT a day. That's the criteria for premium mass now is 1,000 Hong Kong ADT to 10,000 Hong Kong ADT at the top end between the 6 different operators. So, this area of direct marketing, this area of credit extension, I think it falls in the same honeypot basket, in the same fragrant honeypot that the junkets have found themselves in.
Yeah, so that's
an interesting one. Hang on a moment, because I do have Martin, who's had his hand up for a while. I don't know whether he wanted to comment on this particular.
Just a quick one. I think to go back to a great question, Sharon, and a very good answer from Ben about a Western way of looking at what does China want. And I think all of us, including the US concessions, have to think differently about that in the future. And I'll just give an anecdote about a briefing I gave to officials in the Ministry of Finance in Beijing about 8 years ago on illegal gambling, illegal betting, and how to create an effective regulated structure. And my colleagues and I at that time gave them this presentation and thought, that's great, they're going to love this. Now they know how to create a regulated structure. And at the end of it, they said, we're not interested in that. We have enough money. We don't need the tax revenue. We're interested in social control. This is a highly negative industry and sector, and we're much more interested in ensuring that there isn't a heightened negative social impact from it. I think that's key for China. So all of us who are involved in some way with operations in this industry have to think about what China wants. It's not money. It's ensuring social control. And I think that impacts on Macau in the future. Obviously, the economic economic impact of capital outflow through Macau has impacted on social control. So the model that comes up for Macau in the future has to consider this and what China wants, but it's not money.
Okay. Alidad, have you got your hand up, or is that from earlier?
Just wanted to clarify that, again, the world has changed as of 13 days ago since this arrest. Yes, casinos used to extend credit in the past. That's how the premium direct model is, both at Sands, where I worked, and at Melco, where I worked. The question is, going forward, it'd be insane to do that because there's so much focus, and the credits are always exceeding the annual limits. Now that the China has actually said, do not exceed that limit, it is insane to actually put a record and say, I'm actually going to be the junket. So I think we all agree that the name of the game is going to be very different, and it's still being worked out. I mean, the government of Macau used to go ahead and give 299 junkets authorities to do that. Do you really think next year there's going to be, even 10 junkets authorized? That everything in the past is gone. The past sins have been washed away. Going forward, there's going to be a new game and new accounting from now on.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where we go forward. Just have a slightly related question that's probably for Steve. Somebody's asking, these heavily cash-rich junkets that we've been talking about that have been diversifying their business models, should any of the other companies that have got into bed with the junkets, if you like, be actually worried about scrutiny from the PRC?
I think given what has happened, people need to be very careful who they're in bed with and what their rap sheet is and whether they're likely to be further exposed. That's why I said everything has changed. I think Alidad is correct. 10 days ago, there was a visible demonstration of change kicked in, and as you look forward, that is a fact. I think Martin touched on the rise, the exponential rise of online betting. I mean, I just see this as empowering the online betting guys as it gets more difficult in Macau. I can see, and it becomes more easy electronic. I'm afraid I can see this being a very significant uptick. The central government politically don't like gaming. If you listen to what the chief executive of Macau didn't say much in his policy address, but he did talk very, very clearly about healthy development. I mean, this is real. These guys are now in the crucible. Healthy development does not necessarily mean gaming. So I think people should be very careful to keep their head below the parapet for a while during the course of this. This is a major fundamental change.
Would anybody else like to chip in? Kelly, we haven't heard from you in a while. Would you like to comment on what you see the future as being?
I guess, I mean, my expertise is more in line with Australia, but, you know,
Yeah.
from what everyone is saying, seeing the progress in mass gaming revenue, that seems to be something, as Alidad alluded to, that the gaming operators in Macau will actually be able to rely on, the concessions notwithstanding in the future. So, yeah, I think the Australian gaming operators are looking to go to could very much translate over into what Macau may look like soon.
Carlos, would you like to say some concluding remarks?
Well, I would say that unlike Australia, we don't have a local demand that will address our problems in the near future. So we'll have to look somewhere else. And given the existence of COVID and travel restrictions, we also don't have any other markets where we can rely to address these problems. Of course, as someone has raised, Hong Kong could be the answer, could make these problems easier in the short term, but that's still to be seen when that will be happen. But of course, the overall conclusion of all of this is that it raises very concerning questions about where we stand as a legal system and what needs to be changed to adapt to the new gaming economy that both the Mainland China government and the Macau government want to Macau. So there's a lot of work to be done.
You say there've been a lot of blurring of the lines between the one country, two systems over the last little while?
Well, it has been confusing because there not been very much clarity on what is being done and why this is being done. As Alidad mentioned earlier, it's quite strange that there is a warrant in China issued in one day, and then suddenly we have an investigation concluded in Macau in the very next day. So I guess there must be more clarity, and we need to understand more clearly what has been done wrongly by these different junket operators and in what terms they can still operate in Macau, if that is feasible or not, and what the government wants them to do. But of course, the system that we had in these last days, that there is a decision in China and then there are several reactions in Macau from both the authorities and then from the operators. I don't believe this is a healthy arrangement. We'll have to change that.
Any concluding comments from anybody else before I wrap this up now? Because I fear that we could sort of go on for an awful lot longer with some of these subjects. So we're very big picture stuff. It's very, very interesting.
As Carlos just said, there's a very interesting point about the legal systems and why an arrest warrant in Wenzhou results in an arrest in Macau the next day. That tends to happen in China. Things are opaque, but perhaps a Chinese idiom is more adept, which is kill chicken to scare the monkeys. And I think that's partly what's happened here as well. You just have to kill one chicken and that scares the rest of the monkeys. So Suncity is being made an example of. I don't think the way the central government works is to clearly publish and articulate policy. It tends to give informal suggestions about what should happen. And then you have to figure out what they really want. And that's the challenge for Macau going forward, figuring out what they really want and what they'll tolerate.
Okay, well, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. That's incredible amount of insight onto the situation that we've seen in Macau. As you all said, we can all agree that everything's changed. We don't really know yet what it's changed to. The junkets are probably gone, at least in Macau, and significantly changed around the rest of Asia. VIP is going to have a massive dent, but how the business model is going to look going further forward is still a matter for debate. So maybe we could perhaps all reconvene at some point next year and pick up our chat and see where we are going. Also like to remind you of a couple of events that we have coming up next year, which will be the ASEAN Gaming Summit in Manila in March. Please register for that if you haven't already. We'd love to have you join us. I'm sure these topics and many more will be front and center, and there'll be a lot of lively debate on all of these things. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a good day.